every school kid in America knows the story. July 16th, 1945. The New Mexico desert. Robert Oppenheimer stares at the fireball rising over the Trinity test site and whispers a line from ancient Hindu scripture. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." That moment, we've been told, is the birth of the atomic age. The moment humanity crossed a line it could never uncross. But here's the question that certain historians, physicists, and intelligence analysts have been quietly asking for decades. A question that has never received a satisfying official answer. What if Oppenheimer wasn't first? What if, 9 months before Trinity, on a foggy morning off the coast of the Baltic Sea, a mushroom cloud rose over a pine forest on a German island, and the people who saw it were told in no uncertain terms to never speak of it again? Welcome to Shadow Chronicle. Today we open a file that certain governments would prefer stayed closed. And the further we go, the harder it becomes to dismiss. To understand what may have happened in October of 1944, you first have to understand the atmosphere of that moment in history. The Third Reich was dying. Anyone with functioning eyes could see it. The Allies had broken through in Normandy. The Eastern Front was collapsing. German cities were being reduced to ash nightly by Allied bombing campaigns. The supply lines were failing. The manpower was gone. In this climate of total desperation, the Nazi leadership clung to one idea above all others: the Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapon. Something so devastating, so technologically unprecedented, that it would force the Allies to the negotiating table. The V-2 rockets were real, but they were strategically useless. They could terrorize London, but they couldn't stop the Red Army. What Hitler needed was a game-changer of a different order. Something that would make the enemy freeze in horror. And this is where a man named Luigi Romersa walks onto the stage. Romersa was not a crank. He was not a conspiracy theorist. He was one of the most respected war correspondents in Italy. A man with direct access to Benito Mussolini. In the autumn of 1944, Mussolini summoned him. The Italian dictator was nervous. He needed to know if Hitler's claims about a world-altering weapon were real or desperate propaganda. Hitler had told him in a private conversation that Germany was close to completing a bomb capable of destroying an entire city in a single strike. Mussolini sent Romersa to Berlin. That his mission was simple: find out if this is a bluff or if it's real. What happened next reads like the script of a spy thriller. But it is documented in Romersa's personal diaries and corroborated by interviews he gave until the end of his life. He arrived in Berlin and was immediately received by members of the security services. He met with Joseph Goebbels. He met with Albert Speer. He was shown the V-2 production facilities at Peenemünde. Impressive, certainly, but not what he was looking for. He wanted to see the disintegration bomb, as it was referred to in the inner circles. Then one morning, before dawn, 2 officers arrived at his quarters. They drove north, toward the Baltic Sea. The destination, according to Romersa's account, was the island of Rügen, or more precisely, a militarily restricted zone on the peninsula known as Bug, or possibly the small island of Greifswalder Oie, just off the coast of Rügen. The exact location remains a point of debate among researchers. But Romersa's description of the landscape leaves little ambiguity about the general area. He described the mood in the car as extremely tense. The officers barely spoke. He was brought to a concrete bunker, partially sunk into the earth. Through thick, filtered glass panels, he could see a stretch of pine forest approximately 1¼ miles in the distance. He was told to look directly toward the light when it came. There was a countdown, and then it happened. Romersa described a flash of light so intense that even through the protective glass panels it caused physical pain in his eyes. It was as if the sun had fallen from the sky, he would later say. The flash was followed immediately by a shock wave that caused the massive bunker to tremble. Dust fell from the ceiling, and then he saw it. A gigantic column of smoke corkscrewing into the sky. It changed color as it rose, from a glowing red at the base to a dirty violet and gray higher up. At the top, it spread outward. The shape was unmistakable. A mushroom. Romersa was a combat reporter. He had seen artillery barrages, aerial bombs, ammunition depot explosions. But he would later say that this was categorically different. This was not a chemical explosion. This was something elemental. Something that operated on a different level of physics entirely. The officers in the bunker did not celebrate. They stood in silence. One of them turned to Romersa and said, "What you have witnessed here will end history." But the most disturbing part of his account comes after. Approximately 1 hour following the explosion, they left the bunker. Romersa was handed a protective suit. White, made of a strange, fibrous material he described as similar to asbestos. Heavy boots. A mask. They drove in a military vehicle toward the epicenter. What Romersa saw there haunted him for the rest of his life. He had expected a crater. But there was no deep crater of the kind left by conventional bombs. Instead, the ground itself had changed. The sand had melted. It had vitrified. Entire sections of the ground looked as though someone had held an enormous welding torch against the earth. The trees, pine trees, had not been knocked over. They had been pulverized. They still stood, but they were stripped completely bare. The bark had been burned away. The wood was still smoldering. And then there were the sheep. The German security services had tethered sheep in the target area as test subjects. Romersa described their condition in terms that are difficult to read even decades later. They had not been torn apart. They had been burned, but from the inside. Some had collapsed into ash that still held the approximate shape of a sheep, until a breeze dissolved them entirely. The men in protective suits moved through the area with Geiger counters. The clicking of those instruments was the only sound in the dead zone. Romersa flew back to Italy and reported to Mussolini. The Italian dictator dared to hope, but the weapon was never used. Why? This is where the analytical detective work becomes genuinely difficult and genuinely fascinating. The official historical record states with considerable confidence that Germany never developed an atomic bomb. The uranium project under Werner Heisenberg, conducted at the underground facility in Haigerloch, was a failure. The Germans lacked sufficient fissile material. They misunderstood criticality calculations. They were building a reactor, not a weapon. This is the accepted consensus. And for Heisenberg's civilian project, that consensus is largely defensible. But researchers like Rainer Karlsch, who spent years combing through Russian and Western archives, have found indicators that a second program may have existed. A black program operating under the auspices of the security services, led by a physicist named Kurt Diebner. Heisenberg wanted to build a reactor for energy production. Diebner, according to this line of research, wanted an explosion. The theory that emerges is worth examining carefully. Germany almost certainly did not have the industrial infrastructure to enrich enough uranium-235 or produce enough plutonium for a conventional fission bomb on the scale of what was later dropped on Hiroshima. Those American factories at Oak Ridge and Hanford were enormous industrial undertakings employing tens of thousands of workers. But that may not have been the approach being pursued. What Deibner's group may have been working on was something different. A hybrid weapon. A device that used precision-shaped conventional explosive charges arranged in a geometrically perfect spherical pattern to compress a small amount of radioactive material to such an extreme degree that it triggered either a fission reaction or, at minimum, an extreme radiological release. A dirty bomb with a nuclear initiator. A tactical weapon rather than a strategic one. This design approach would explain the absence of a massive crater. It would explain why the heat was sufficient to vitrify sand. A phenomenon known as trinitite. First documented at the American Trinity test site in New Mexico. Without producing the kind of total structural obliteration associated with a full-yield fission bomb. It would explain why the radiation was localized but lethal. And it would explain why neither the United States nor the Soviet Union chose to make any of this public. That last point is where the geopolitical dimension of the silence becomes important. For the United States, the Manhattan Project was the supreme scientific achievement of the war. Perhaps of the century. The narrative was clean. American ingenuity, American resources, American sacrifice had unlocked the atom. The idea that a collapsing Nazi regime, operating with a fraction of the resources, might have achieved a functioning tactical nuclear detonation, possibly before the Americans, was politically intolerable. It would have shattered the mythology of American technological supremacy that the entire post-war world order was being built upon. For the Soviet Union, the calculus was different. They wanted the technology. The Soviet forces occupied Thuringia, where a second possible test site exists, according to witness accounts from March of 1945, before American forces arrived and held it for a period. There is, in fact, a Soviet military intelligence report addressed to Joseph Stalin, dated March of 1945, which describes 2 large explosions in Thuringia. The document states that trees were knocked down, that prisoners of war were killed, and that the device likely contained uranium-235. Stalin knew. So why did the Western historical record go quiet on this? The answer may lie with a single name: Hans Kammler. Kammler was a senior officer in the security services, the man responsible for all of the secret technology programs of the Third Reich. The V-2 rocket program, the underground production facilities, and, according to the theory being examined here, the atomic weapons project. In May of 1945, Kammler disappeared. He was never found, not alive, not dead. No confirmed grave. No reliable witnesses to his fate. Some serious researchers, not fringe theorists, but people who have worked with primary source documents, have proposed that Kammler did not die. That he made a deal. That under Operation Paperclip, the American program that brought German scientists to the United States, Kammler was not merely a bargaining chip, but the central transaction. That he handed over not just Wernher von Braun and the rocket scientists, but the documentation of what had been tested on Rügen. In exchange, a new identity, freedom, and silence. Now this would explain why certain files related to Kammler in American archives remain partially classified to this day. A mass murderer who walked free because he held the key to a technological secret too sensitive to expose. That is a scandal no government willingly volunteers. But let us now turn to the physical evidence. Because history can be rewritten. Testimonies can be discredited, but isotopes cannot be silenced. Radioactive material has a half-life. Certain isotopes, cesium-137, cobalt-60, persist in the environment for decades. If a nuclear or hybrid nuclear detonation occurred on Rügen in October of 1944, the ground should still carry the signature of that event. After German reunification in the early 2000s, independent researchers began asking questions that the Cold War had kept off limits. Historian Rainer Karlsch published a book titled Hitler's Bomb that triggered significant controversy. He did not merely assert that these tests occurred. He presented soil samples. Karlsch and his team took samples near the suspected explosion sites. What they found has been disputed ever since. They found elevated concentrations of cesium-137. Critics immediately invoked Chernobyl, the 1986 reactor disaster that spread fallout across much of Europe. But isotopes have fingerprints. The ratios of different elements within a sample reveal the source of their origin. And the samples from Rügen and subsequently from Thuringia showed anomalies inconsistent with the known Chernobyl fallout signature. They also found vitrified quartz, sand that had been subjected to temperatures so extreme it had fused into glass. Trinitite, a phenomenon documented at the American Trinity test site in New Mexico, produced by the fireball of a nuclear detonation. How does trinitite end up on a Baltic Sea beach if nothing exploded there? The Bug Peninsula on the northwest coast of Rügen was a military restricted zone for decades. First under the Wehrmacht, then under the Soviet occupation forces, then under the East German People's Navy. Access was strictly prohibited. Was this standard Cold War military security? Or was it something closer to a quarantine? There are Stasi, the East German secret police, reports describing anomalous radiation readings in that area, which were reportedly explained to soldiers stationed there as naturally occurring background radiation. Perhaps that explanation was accurate. But it is worth noting that such an explanation would be equally useful whether the radiation was natural or not. Let us return briefly to Luigi Romersa, because his credibility matters to everything that follows. Romersa survived the war. He continued working as a journalist for decades. He told this story consistently until his death in the early 2000s. He never embellished it for effect. He never sought fame from it. He never displayed the behavior of someone manufacturing a legend. When pressed for proof, he gave an answer that is either the most honest thing a witness can say or the most convenient. The proof is in my memory. I still see the light. That is not the answer of a man who invented a story. It is the answer of a man who knows that what he saw cannot be fully transferred to anyone who wasn't there. So where does all of this leave us? It leaves us in a position of genuine analytical uncertainty, which is precisely where intellectual honesty requires us to stay. The official narrative has real weight. Germany almost certainly did not build a bomb comparable to what was dropped on Hiroshima. The industrial gap was too large. The confirmed scientific documentation supports the conclusion that the Heisenberg project was a failure. But the official narrative does not fully account for Romersa. It does not fully account for the Soviet intelligence report to Stalin. It does not explain the anomalous isotope ratios in the soil samples. It does not resolve the question of Hans Kammler's disappearance. And it does not explain why certain archival materials connected to these questions remain restricted. The alternative hypothesis that a hybrid nuclear tactical device was tested on Rügen in October of 1944. That the test was partially successful. That the weapon was never deployed for reasons that remain unclear. And that both American and Soviet authorities had strong incentives to bury the story. This hypothesis does not require extraordinary leaps of logic. It requires only that we take the documented evidence seriously rather than dismissing it, because it complicates a more comfortable version of history. What seems clear is this. If something was tested on that Baltic coastline in 1944, the decision not to deploy it may be one of the most consequential decisions ever made. And we may never know with certainty who made it or why. Perhaps the weapon was too unstable to deploy reliably. Perhaps the delivery system, a V-2 rocket, was too inaccurate and could barely carry the weight. A bomber would have been shot down by Allied air superiority, was inadequate. Or perhaps, and this possibility is the most unsettling of all, there were people within the program itself who looked into the abyss that had been opened on that island. The violet mushroom dissolving the sheep into ash, and decided quietly, without orders from above, not this. Not this weapon. Not us. Sabotage from within. The most human of interventions in the most inhuman of moments. Somewhere under the moss and sand of the Bug Peninsula. If the soil samples mean anything at all, the ghost of that day still persists. You cannot rewrite isotopes. You cannot classify a half-life. The Earth keeps its own records, new indifferent to the political needs of the governments above it. The story of the atomic age may be more complicated than the one we've been told. The clean narrative, American Genius, New Mexico Desert, August 1945, may be accurate in its broad outlines while obscuring something important in its details. That is not unusual in history. It is, in fact, the rule rather than the exception. The question is whether we are willing to keep asking. If what Luigi Romersa witnessed was real. If the first mushroom cloud rose not over New Mexico, but over the pine forests of a German island in 1944, then the history of the atomic age begins not in triumph, but in darkness. Not as a scientific achievement to be celebrated, but as a secret buried beneath decades of silence, soil, and political inconvenience. The ground on Rügen does not speak loudly. But it does not lie either. If this investigation raised questions you hadn't considered before, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that these buried stories deserve to be heard. Subscribe to Shadow Chronicle so you don't miss what we uncover next. And drop your analysis in the comments below. Do you think the evidence points to a real test, or is Romersa's account something else entirely? Your perspective matters in building the full picture.